never imagined that an ordinary cup of tea could change my life forever. It began like any other evening, the kind where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and crimson, and the faint smell of rain clung to the air. The house was unusually quiet, too quiet, almost as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when my husband called out from the kitchen. His voice carried a tone I hadn't heard in years, gentle, affectionate, almost rehearsed. "Made you something special, dear?" he said cheerfully. I froze for a moment. My husband rarely stepped foot in the kitchen. He wasn't the type to surprise me with thoughtful gestures, at least not anymore. Something about the way he said it made a chill run down my spine. When I walked in, I saw him standing there, smiling too widely, holding out a steaming cup of tea. The steam rose in twisting curls, carrying with it a smell that instantly caught my attention. It wasn't right. The aroma was sharp, metallic, almost bitter, nothing like the sweet, earthy fragrance of my usual tea. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, but his eyes were fixed on me, expectant, almost insistent, waiting for me to take the cup. I forced a smile and said, "You're so kind." My voice trembled just slightly, but he didn't seem to notice. I accepted the tea, though every fiber of my body told me not to. I lifted it to my lips, hesitating. The smell only grew stronger, almost nauseating now, as though the cup itself was warning me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my brother-in-law. He sat in the living room, sprawled across the couch as always, mocking me with his usual smugness. He had spent years making jokes at my expense, laughing at me in front of family, never missing an opportunity to belittle me. A sudden thought struck me like lightning. My hands trembled as I lowered the cup. An idea, dark, dangerous, and reckless, began to form in my mind. What if I didn't drink it? What if I let him drink it instead? I don't know what gave me the courage or the madness to even think of such a thing. But in that instant, something inside me shifted. My fear turned into something sharper, stronger. I waited for the perfect moment. My husband's back was turned, fussing with something on the counter. My brother-in-law laughed at one of his own cruel jokes, sipping his drink carelessly. The room was dim, shadows dancing across the walls, making it easier for me to move unnoticed. Slowly, silently, I walked over to the table where my brother-in-law's cup rested. With a calmness I didn't know I had, I placed my husband's steaming cup of tea beside it. Then, in one swift motion, I switched them. No one noticed. I held my breath as I sat back down, pretending to sip from the other cup. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. My hands were clammy, my throat dry. I couldn't believe what I had just done. And then, the moment I'd been waiting for, my brother-in-law reached for the cup. He didn't hesitate. He didn't sniff it, didn't question the strange smell. He simply raised it to his lips and drank. I watched him swallow, and with every gulp he took, a knot tightened in my chest. What had I just set in motion? At first, nothing happened. He went on talking, laughing, throwing sarcastic remarks in my direction. I sat there, forcing a smile, nodding, though inside I was a storm of fear and anticipation. Minutes crawled by like hours. I kept glancing at my husband. His eyes flickered between me and his brother, narrowing slightly when he noticed the cup in his brother's hand. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That silence scared me more than anything. Why wasn't he saying anything? Did he already know? Did he realize what I had done? I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, the weight of his gaze pressing on me like a physical force. My pulse raced, and I could feel a bead of sweat trickle down my back. The air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy and suffocating. Every tick of the clock on the wall grew louder, echoing through my mind like a countdown. And then, it began. My brother-in-law suddenly stopped mid-laugh. His hand trembled slightly as he set the cup down. He pressed a hand to his chest, frowning. "Strange," he muttered. "I feel odd." His voice was strained, his face pale. A sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an explanation. My husband's eyes widened for a split second, then narrowed. He looked straight at me, and in that moment, I knew. The tea had been meant for me. I swallowed hard, my mind reeling. My brother-in-law wiped his brow, chuckling nervously. "Must be the heat in here," he said, though his voice shook. But I could see it. Something was happening to him. His breathing grew shallow, his laughter faltered, and his hand trembled violently. I gripped the edge of my chair, trying to steady myself. My heart raced so fast I thought it would burst. The room felt like it was spinning, every second stretching into eternity. And my husband? He didn't move. He didn't rush to help his brother. He just watched him squirm, watched him sweat, watched him choke on invisible air, and all the while, his gaze never left me. I knew then that I had stepped into something far darker than I had imagined. That cup of tea wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. And my husband's silence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some harmless mistake. That tea had been meant to end me, and now, as I sat there watching my brother-in-law slowly unravel, I realized the truth. By switching those cups, I had not only saved myself, I had also exposed a secret my husband had desperately tried to keep hidden. But what terrified me most wasn't the tea, or the sight of my brother-in-law beginning to tremble. It was the cold, calculating look in my husband's eyes, because that look told me one chilling thing: this wasn't over. My brother-in-law coughed, sharp and sudden, his face tightening in discomfort. His laughter, once so loud and mocking, cracked into silence. He gripped the arm of the couch, his knuckles white. I watched every twitch of his body, every flicker of his expression. I should have felt relief that the humiliation he'd given me for years was finally turning back on him. But instead I felt something else. Dread. Because I knew this wasn't meant for him. It was meant for me. I glanced at my husband. He was leaning casually against the counter, but there was nothing casual about the way his eyes locked on me. His lips pressed together, a thin line of frustration. He knew. He knew I had switched the cups, and that knowledge twisted my stomach in knots. My brother-in-law shifted uncomfortably, laughing nervously as he wiped sweat from his forehead. You put too much ginger in this, or what?" he said, trying to lighten the mood. His voice cracked, his words uneven. No one laughed. The silence was unbearable. The ticking of the clock hammered in my skull. Each second felt like a nail being driven deeper into the coffin of normalcy. I forced a laugh, weak and hollow. "Maybe it's just the heat," I said. My voice sounded distant, not even mine. But my husband's eyes never left me. I knew he was replaying the moment in his mind. How I'd held the cup, how I'd hesitated, how I'd smiled just a little too wide. He was calculating, analyzing, trying to figure out how I had outplayed him. And the terrifying part? I didn't know how long I could keep the act going. Minutes crawled by. My brother-in-law fanned himself, muttering about dizziness, his complexion turning an alarming shade of gray. He staggered slightly as he stood, swaying on his feet. "Maybe I should get some air," he murmured, stumbling toward the door. My husband didn't move to help him, didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed locked on me, unblinking, predatory. And in that silence, something inside me snapped. I realized this wasn't just about tea. This was a test. My husband had planned this moment carefully, like a hunter setting a trap. He wanted to see if I would drink without question, if I would trust him blindly. And when I didn't, when I shifted fate onto someone else, his game changed. Because now, he knew I was aware, and awareness made me dangerous. My brother-in-law stumbled outside, gasping for air. I could hear his ragged breathing even from inside the house. My heart hammered in my chest, torn between following him or staying frozen under my husband's icy stare. Finally, I forced myself to speak. My voice was small but steady enough. Maybe he's allergic to something in the tea," I said carefully. My husband tilted his head, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. A smile that chilled me to my bones. "Allergies," he repeated softly, almost amused. He didn't believe me, and worse, I knew he wasn't going to let this go. I set my cup down slowly, trying to steady my trembling hands. The liquid inside rippled with the motion, its strange smell rising once more. I couldn't bear to look at it. For a brief moment, I wondered what would have happened if I had drunk it. Would I be the one stumbling outside, gasping for air? Would I be the one fighting to stay conscious while my husband simply watched? The thought made my blood run cold. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. But my instincts told me to stay silent, to play along, to pretend I suspected nothing. Because if I showed my fear too openly, if I confronted him too soon, I might not live long enough to hear the truth. So I smiled, forced, fragile, hollow. And I whispered, "Thank you for the tea." The next few minutes blurred together, thick with tension. My brother-in-law eventually returned, pale and shaken, muttering about needing to lie down. He barely looked at me, too consumed by whatever was wreaking havoc inside his body. But my husband, he never looked away. Every glance, every shift in his expression felt like a silent accusation. "You should have been the one." I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just painted a target on my back. That by saving myself tonight, I had only postponed the inevitable. And yet, a darker thought whispered at the back of my mind. What if I hadn't swapped the cups? What if I had drunk the tea? Would anyone have believed it was an accident? No. They would have believed him. And that realization sent a shiver down my spine. The night dragged on. My husband said little, his silence more terrifying than words. My brother-in-law eventually retreated to his room, still pale, still sweating. I was left alone with him, my husband, the man I once trusted more than anyone else. And in that silence, I finally understood something I'd been too blind to see before. This wasn't the first time. The odd meals he insisted on preparing suddenly replayed in my memory. The times I'd felt unwell after dinner, chalking it up to stress. The unexplained pills I found once in the drawer, brushed off as vitamins. How many times had he tried before? How many times had I been too distracted, too trusting, too naive to notice? The realization crushed me, suffocating and sharp, but alongside the fear came resolve. I couldn't just sit and wait for the next cup of tea, the next suspicious meal, the next trap. I had to be ready. I had to outsmart him again, because if tonight proved anything, it was that he wasn't going to stop, and neither was I. That night, lying awake in the dark, I replayed every second of the evening. The smell of the tea still lingered in my nose, bitter and haunting. The look in his eyes burned into my mind. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. By switching those cups, I hadn't just saved my life. I had declared war, and war never ends with just one battle. It started slowly. At first, my brother-in-law's discomfort could have been mistaken for something ordinary. A bad stomach, maybe dizziness from standing too quickly. He even tried to brush it off with a forced laugh. But I noticed the change in him long before anyone else did. The color drained from his face, his lips tightening as if each breath was harder to take than the last. He clutched his stomach, shifting in his seat, muttering that maybe he had eaten too much at dinner. But I knew better. I knew exactly what was happening. And as the minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last, I realized I was living inside a countdown I couldn't stop. The first 5 minutes were nothing more than unease. His laughter came in broken fits, shorter, sharper. His words clipped. He excused himself to stretch, his body swaying slightly. By the 10th minute, sweat dotted his forehead. His hand shook as he reached for his glass of water, spilling a few drops down his shirt. He laughed nervously, but his voice cracked, brittle. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body tense, my hands gripping the edge of my chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. And across the room, my husband watched. He didn't rush to help. He didn't move. He just leaned back, calm, still, eyes fixed on me. It was like the world had split into two realities. One where my brother-in-law was unraveling before my eyes, and another where my husband and I were locked in a silent, dangerous game of recognition. He knew, I knew. And in that shared awareness, the walls of our marriage began to crumble. By the 15th minute, panic set in. My brother-in-law staggered toward the door, muttering something about fresh air, his words slurring. His hands clutched the frame for balance, his breath sharp and shallow. He looked back at us, confusion written across his face. What was in that tea?" he whispered. The question cut through the room like a blade. I felt my pulse in my throat choking me. My husband didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. A small, cold, terrifying smile. And in that moment, I realized something more, horrifying than the tea itself. He wasn't just waiting for me to drink it. He wanted me to see it happen. The 20th minute arrived like the toll of a clock tower bell. My brother-in-law collapsed. Onto the floor, gasping, his body convulsing. His eyes bulged, his fingers clawing at the carpet. I shot up from my chair instinctively, but froze when I saw my husband move. Not to help. Not to call for an ambulance, but to block me. He stepped in front of me, calm, collected, his eyes boring into mine. "Sit down," he whispered. His voice was low, steady, commanding. I shook my head, my body trembling. "We have to help him." But his smile widened, cruel and knowing. "Do we?" Those words froze me more than any shout could. For a split second, I thought about running. About grabbing the phone, calling for help, screaming until someone came. But something in his eyes stopped me. A promise, a threat, a warning all at once. He knew what I had done. He knew I had switched the cups. And now, if I exposed him, I would expose myself too. Because who would believe me? Who would believe that I, the wife, had swapped drinks behind everyone's backs? To them, it would look like I had tried to kill my brother-in-law. I sat back down, my legs weak, my mind racing, and in that terrifying moment, I understood. This wasn't just a poisoning. This was a trap. The room filled with the sounds of struggle. My brother-in-law's wheezing, the scrape of his shoes against the floor, the thud of his body twitching against the couch. But my husband's silence was louder than all of it. He crouched down beside his brother, his face a mask of false concern. He patted his back gently, almost tenderly, and whispered, "Breathe. Just breathe." Then he looked up at me, eyes gleaming with malice, and mouthed 2 words. "Your turn." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He wasn't afraid of being caught. He wasn't panicked because he had planned for this. Every second of it. If his brother survived, the story could easily shift. "She swapped the cups," he could say. "I saw her." Who would deny him? And if his brother didn't survive, then I was already trapped in a house with a murderer. Minutes dragged like hours. My brother-in-law's convulsions slowed, his breath shallow but steadying. He wasn't gone, not yet, and I couldn't decide what terrified me more, if he lived, or if he didn't, because either way my husband held all the cards. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my husband stood. He brushed off his hands casually, as if nothing had happened, and walked back toward me. He leaned down, his lips close to my ear, his breath hot against my skin. "You switched the cups," he whispered. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" I froze, unable to speak, my body trembling under the weight of his words. Then he straightened, his smile returning, and in a louder voice said, "Maybe it's just food poisoning. He'll be fine," as if nothing had happened, as if the last 20 minutes hadn't changed everything. That night, as I lay awake listening to the shallow breaths of my brother-in-law in the next room, I couldn't stop replaying the look in my husband's eyes. He hadn't been surprised, not once. And that could only mean one thing. The tea was never about killing me. It was about watching me choose, watching me reveal the kind of person I really was. And I had fallen straight into his trap. But what I didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning. The tea was just the first move. The opening gambit in a game far more twisted than I could have ever imagined. And in that game, trust was a weapon, lies were the board, and survival. Survival would demand a price I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. I can still hear the sound of his body hitting the floor. It wasn't just a thud. It was a sound that carried weight, final, suffocating, terrifying. My brother-in-law's face twisted in agony, his eyes bulging. his hands clawing desperately at the carpet as if he could hold on to life itself. The laughter that had once filled the room was gone. All that remained was the horrifying sound of his gasps, sharp and ragged, as though he were drowning in plain air. I froze, every muscle in my body locked, my breath trapped inside my chest. I wanted to move, to help him, to scream, but my husband's presence anchored me in place. Because he wasn't reacting the way any normal person would. No rush to the phone, no panic in his voice, no desperation to save his own brother. Instead, he just stood there, watching. There was something unbearable in the stillness of his figure. His eyes followed every twitch, every spasm, every choking gasp that escaped his brother's mouth. And then, as if he sensed me watching him, he turned his head ever so slightly, his gaze colliding with mine. That gaze held no shock. No fear, only disappointment. As if the collapse on the floor wasn't the failure. I was. I tried to break free of that stare. I forced myself to move, rushing to the fallen man's side, but my hands trembled so violently I could barely touch him. His skin was clammy, his eyes rolling back, his breath shallow and uneven. "Stay with me," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Stay with me." But even as I said it, I could feel how useless my words were. Behind me, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The sound of shoes against the wooden floor, echoing like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. Then a voice, calm, low, unbearably steady. Why bother? I froze, my hand still gripping his shoulder, my head snapping up to look at my husband. He stood above us, his hands in his pockets, tilting his head slightly like a spectator at some cruel game. "Call an ambulance," I shouted, desperation cracking my voice. But he didn't move. Didn't even flinch. Instead, he crouched down beside me, his face so close to mine that I could feel the warmth of his breath. His lips curled into the faintest smile as he whispered, "Just for me." Too late. I wanted to scream at him, to slap that twisted smile off his face, but before I could, my brother-in-law groaned. A sound of pain, a sound of life, I gasped, relief flooding through me. He wasn't gone. Not yet. I reached for the phone on the table, but my husband's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with a strength that made me wince. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and dangerous. "Don't," he said. Just one word, but it carried the weight of 1,000 threats. For a moment, we stayed frozen like that. Me kneeling beside a collapsing man, him crouched like a predator holding its prey. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. Finally, he let go, his smile returning. "Go ahead," he said softly. "Call them. But remember," his voice dropped lower, colder, "you're the one who gave him the tea." The words hit me harder than any blow. My hand hovered over the phone, trembling, because he was right. No one else had seen the switch. No one else had noticed my hesitation. To the world, it would look like I had been the one who handed my brother-in-law his death. And if he died before help arrived, I'd be the one blamed. I pulled my hand back slowly, my chest heaving. My brother-in-law convulsed again, his nails scraping against the carpet, a desperate animal sound tearing from his throat. Tears burned my eyes. "Please," I whispered to my husband, my voice breaking. "Please, he's your brother." But he only tilted his head, studying me with a detached curiosity, like I was an insect trapped in glass. "You keep saying my brother," he murmured. "Funny, isn't it? How suddenly you care." My stomach twisted. His words weren't just cruel. They carried something deeper, something I didn't yet understand. But I had no time to unravel his meaning, because right then, my brother-in-law's body went still. The silence that followed was unbearable. No gasps, no groans, no movement. I shook him desperately. No, stay with me. Stay with me! But he didn't respond, and when I looked up, my husband was smiling. That smile will haunt me forever. It wasn't relief. It wasn't grief. It was something far worse. It was satisfaction. I stumbled back, my hand covering my mouth, a sob escaping me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "What did you do?" I cried, my voice breaking into pieces, but he didn't answer. He just stood, straightened his shirt, and walked calmly toward the kitchen. His voice floated back to me, casual, almost bored. "Clean yourself up," he said. "You look guilty." Those words chilled me more than anything else he had said that night, because they weren't about what had just happened. They were about what was coming next. He wasn't worried about his brother lying motionless on the floor. He wasn't worried about being caught. He was already preparing the story. And in his story, I wasn't the victim. I was the culprit. The weight of it pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. My hands trembled as I touched my brother-in-law's wrist, praying for a pulse, for anything, and then, faint, weak, but there, a heartbeat. He wasn't gone. Not yet. Hope surged through me, but it was fleeting. Because if he survived, if he woke up, he would carry the truth of what happened tonight. And the terrifying question echoed in my mind. Would he tell it? Or would my husband make sure he never got the chance? I sat there in the silence, torn between calling for help and protecting myself, between saving his life and saving my own. Every choice felt like a trap. Every path led deeper into my husband's web. And as the minutes ticked by, as the weight of the night pressed harder against my chest, I realized something chilling. The tea wasn't the crime. The collapse wasn't the end. They were only the beginning of something far darker. Because in this house, nothing was ever what it seemed, and I was already caught in a story I couldn't escape. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of secrets. My brother-in-law lay unconscious in the next room, his shallow breaths barely audible. And somewhere beyond that silence, my husband moved quietly, methodically, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But something inside me had shifted. I couldn't sit still anymore. I couldn't pretend. Not after what I had seen in his eyes. That tea, his calmness, his words, all of it screamed that this was bigger than one poisoned cup. And if I wanted to survive, I needed to know the truth. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade down the hall, the creak of the floorboards disappearing into his study. Only then did I rise, my body trembling, my heart pounding so loud I feared it might give me away. I walked into the kitchen, the room where it had all begun. The faint smell of that bitter tea still clung to the air, sharp and metallic. It lingered like a ghost, reminding me of how close I had come to drinking it myself. The cup still sat on the counter, untouched, mocking me. I forced myself to look away and began searching. At first, I found nothing out of the ordinary. Drawers filled with cutlery, shelves lined with spices, the usual clutter of a household kitchen. But then, tucked behind the neatly stacked jars of flour and sugar, I found something that didn't belong. A small box, wooden, locked. My breath caught in my throat. Hands shaking, I pulled it out, setting it on the counter. The lock was simple, nothing more than a latch, but the weight of it felt heavy, ominous. I pried it open, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. There were vials, dozens of them, each filled with liquids of different colors, some cloudy, some clear, some glowing faintly under the dim light. Their labels were faded, handwritten in my husband's unmistakable script. Next to them, tiny packets of powder, folded neatly into squares of parchment. Some were marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize, and beneath it all, papers, old letters, their edges yellowed and curling. My hands trembled as I unfolded the first one. The handwriting was messy, hurried, nothing like my husband's usual precision. But the words leapt off the page, sharp and cruel. "She knows. End it before she speaks," I gasped, dropping the paper as if it had burned me. My chest tightened, my stomach twisting violently. Who was she? Me? Someone else? I grabbed another letter, my eyes scanning the words desperately. "Use the mixture. Quick, clean, no trace." My throat went dry. The letters weren't just random notes. They were instructions. Instructions for murder. I couldn't stop. I rifled through them one after another. Some were written by my husband, others by an unknown hand. But the message was always the same. Mixtures, timings, details of how to make something disappear. Not just people. Evidence. I stumbled back, the papers slipping from my hands. My breathing was ragged, my vision blurry with tears. This wasn't just about tonight. This wasn't just about a cup of tea. This had been going on for a long, long time. I pressed a hand against my mouth, stifling a sob. My mind reeled, questions clawing at me. Who were these letters from? Who else was involved? And how many times had my husband done this before? I wanted to stop. I wanted to close the box, shove it back, and pretend I had never seen it. But a darker part of me, the part that had switched the cups, wouldn't let me. So I kept searching. At the very bottom of the box, hidden beneath the vials and letters, was a photograph. My breath caught as I pulled it out. It was old, faded, the edges worn. My husband stood in the center, younger but unmistakable, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. She was smiling, radiant, her eyes bright with life. On the back, scrawled in faint ink, were 3 words. She betrayed me. The room spun, my knees buckled, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. Who was she? What had she done? And what had he done to her? The answers swirled in my mind, dark and suffocating. But before I could think, before I could breathe, I heard it. Footsteps. My blood ran cold. I shoved the photograph back into the box, scrambling to cover the vials and papers, my hands fumbling in panic, but the lock wouldn't close. My fingers slipped. My breath quickened. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I shoved the box back into the cupboard just as the door creaked open. And there he was. My husband stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned into me like fire. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. I froze. My mouth went dry, my body trembling. "Just cleaning," I whispered. For a moment, silence, the kind of silence that suffocates, that drowns you in its weight. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Good," he said. "Keep it clean," and without another word, he turned and walked away. I collapsed against the counter, my body shaking violently, tears spilling down my cheeks. He knew. He had to know. And if he knew I had seen inside that box, then I wasn't just living with a murderer. I was living with a man who was already planning my end. That night, as I lay awake, the image of that photograph burned into my mind. The woman's smile, the words on the back. She betrayed me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because if betrayal had earned her a place in that box of secrets, then what fate had I just signed for myself? And yet, even in my fear, one thought kept circling in my mind, relentless and undeniable. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't just wait for him to make the next move. I had to find out everything. About the vials, about the letters, about the woman in the photograph. Because if I didn't, I knew exactly where I'd end up. This wasn't just about a poisoned cup anymore. It was about a man with a history, a man with connections, a man with secrets so dark they hid in plain sight, behind the walls of my own home. And I had just peeled back the first layer. What lay beneath would change everything. The hospital was cold, not just from the sterile air or the hum of the machines, but from the weight pressing down on my chest as I sat there, waiting. My brother-in-law had been rushed in unconscious, his lips pale, his breathing shallow. Doctors and nurses moved around him with urgency, their voices clipped, their eyes sharp with focus. And I sat in the corner, my hands gripping the chair so tightly my knuckles were white. Because I wasn't just worried about whether he would live. I was terrified of what might happen if he did. I kept replaying it in my head. The tea, the switch, the letters in the kitchen box, the photograph of the smiling woman marked with betrayal. It was all too much, too tangled, and yet somehow I knew. All of it was connected. But how? I didn't have time to think before the doctor approached. "He's stable, for now," he said, adjusting his glasses. "But when he wakes up, he'll be very weak. Limit his stress." Limit his stress. As if that were possible. Because if my suspicions were right, stress was the least of our problems. Hours passed. I sat by his bedside, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. The rise and fall of his chest was shallow but steady. Then, sometime in the dead of night, he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, groggy, unfocused, but alive. "Water," he whispered, his throat dry. I poured from the jug on the table, my hands trembling as I held the glass to his lips. He drank, coughing, then slumped back against the pillows. His eyes moved to me. For a long moment he just stared, and then he smirked. Even on the brink of death, he still managed to mock me. "You switched it, didn't you?" he croaked. The words hit me like a slap. My breath caught, my heart pounding. "What? What do you mean?" I whispered, though the guilt was written across my face. He chuckled weakly, his voice raspy. "I saw it. Thought you were clever. You always think you're clever." I froze. He knew. He had seen me switch the cups. "And you saved yourself," he whispered. "But you don't even know the half of it, do you?" The air grew heavy. My pulse hammered in my ears. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He turned his head slightly, his eyes dark and knowing. "He wasn't after you," he said. "Not this time." My stomach dropped. "What?" The smirk faded from his lips, replaced by a grim expression. "He wanted me gone. And you just sped it up." My mind reeled. So all this time, I thought I was the target. I thought my husband had laced that tea for me. But it wasn't me at all. It was him, my brother-in-law. I shook my head, disbelief clawing at me. "Why? Why would he want to get rid of you?" His eyes flickered with something between shame and satisfaction. "Because I know too much," he whispered. The room seemed to shrink around me. "Too much about what?" I pressed. He coughed, his body shaking, then leaned closer, his voice a ragged whisper. "About her." The word hung in the air like poison. Her. The woman in the photograph. The one who had betrayed him. Who was she? I demanded, my voice breaking. His eyes closed briefly, as though even speaking her name was a weight he could barely carry. "She was my sister." I froze. The world tilted. My vision blurred. Your sister?" I stammered. He opened his eyes again, and in them I saw something I had never expected. Pain. Real human pain? "Yes," he said. "She was my sister. And she was his wife. Before you." The words crashed over me like waves, suffocating, relentless. Before me. Another wife. Another woman. The woman in the photograph wasn't just some stranger. She was family. "She found out what he was doing," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The experiments, the mixtures, the things he kept hidden. She wanted to leave him, to expose him." Tears burned my eyes. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. "What happened to her?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. His jaw clenched, his gaze dark. "She betrayed him, and he made sure she paid for it. The photograph, the vials, the letters." It all made sense now. The smiling woman had been real, alive, in love. Until she discovered what he really was, and then she was gone. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the bedsheet, my body shaking. "But why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you go to the police?" His bitter laugh filled the room, hollow and sharp. "You think I didn't try? You think anyone listens when you accuse a man like him? He's too careful, too smart. No evidence, just whispers." The pieces fell into place, jagged and cruel. That's why my husband had wanted him gone, because he was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who had seen what my husband had done. And now, he was lying in this hospital bed, poisoned and barely clinging to life. My chest tightened. I had thought switching the cups had saved me, but in reality, I had just stepped into a battlefield that had been raging long before I ever arrived, and the sides were far from clear. I leaned closer, desperate, my voice trembling. "Why tell me this now?" He turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine with a strange intensity. "Because you need to know what you married. You need to know before it's too late." His words cut into me like a blade. Too late. Was it already too late? I opened my mouth to speak, to beg him to tell me more, but the door creaked open. And there he was. My husband, standing in the doorway, his face calm, his eyes sharp. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then slowly he stepped inside, his gaze fixed on me. "You should rest," he said softly, his voice steady, almost soothing. "He needs quiet." But beneath those calm words, I heard it. The threat. The warning. And in that moment, I realized something horrifying. He knew. He knew his brother had spoken to me. And now, I was part of the secret too. That night, as I lay awake in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his words haunted me. She betrayed him, and he made sure she paid. I could almost hear her voice, the woman in the photograph, could almost see her smile, bright and alive, before it was snuffed out. And I couldn't escape the truth gnawing at my soul. I was walking her path, step by step, and if I didn't find a way out, soon, I would share her fate. But even as fear consumed me, one thought burned stronger than the rest. He thought he had silenced her. He thought he had silenced his brother, and he thought he could silence me too. But he was wrong. Because this time, I wasn't going down quietly. The hospital lights hummed above me, harsh and unrelenting. I hadn't slept in days. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the woman in the photograph, smiling, radiant, alive, and then gone. She betrayed him. The words echoed over and over, and he made sure she paid. Now I knew the truth. My husband was a murderer, not in theory, not in suspicion, but in fact, and I was next. I sat in that chair staring at the floor, the weight of everything crushing me, fear, anger, helplessness. But beneath it all, something else stirred, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Defiance. Because if what my brother-in-law said was true, then I had been chosen. He thought I was just another name to cross off his list. But he was wrong. I wasn't going to end up like her. I wasn't going to die quietly. This time, the story would end differently. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The doctors insisted my brother-in-law stay overnight. My husband offered to drive me home. His voice was calm, gentle, but I knew better now. Every word, every gesture was another move in his game. I agreed anyway. Because if this was a game, it was time I learned how to play. The drive home was silent. Streetlights flashed across his face, casting shadows that twisted his features. His hands rested easily on the wheel, but his jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I sat in the passenger seat, my fingers gripping the seatbelt. Every second felt like borrowed time. Finally, I spoke. "Why him?" He didn't look at me. Didn't flinch. "Why who?" He asked softly. "Your brother," I said. My voice was steady, though my chest tightened with each word. "Why did you want him gone?" The car slowed. He pulled over to the side of the road, turning to face me. And then he smiled. Not the charming smile I once fell in love with, no. This was colder, crueler. "You've been busy," he said. My blood froze. He knew. He knew I had looked in the box. He knew I had spoken to his brother. And now, the mask was gone. "You were supposed to drink that tea," he said calmly, almost tenderly. "But then, you didn't. And here we are." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. "Why? Why me?" He leaned closer, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "Because you asked too many questions. Because you got too close. Just like she did. The woman in the photograph." I felt tears sting my eyes, but I forced myself not to look away. "She was your wife," I whispered. His smile faltered, just for a moment. "She betrayed me," he said, his voice sharp now, cold. "She was going to destroy everything I worked for. Everything I built. And so you destroyed her," I spat, my voice breaking. His silence was answer enough. We sat there, locked in a battle of stares. For the first time, I saw him not as my husband, but as what he truly was, a predator, and I was prey. But not for long. I forced myself to breathe, to think. If he believed I was already broken, already cornered, then I still had a chance. So I let my tears fall, let my shoulders sag. "You're right," I whispered. "I was foolish. I didn't understand. But I do now." His eyes narrowed. "Do you?" "Yes," I said quickly. "I'll stop asking. I'll stop digging. I'll be the wife you need." The lie tasted like ash on my tongue, but I saw it. The flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. And I knew. I had just bought myself time. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing. My heart pounded, my mind racing. I couldn't stay silent forever. I couldn't pretend, if I did, I would end up just like her. I had to act. But how? The police. That was the obvious choice. But I had no proof. The vials, the letters. I couldn't risk going back for them. And even if I did, would they believe me? Or would they see me as a hysterical wife spinning stories in fear? No. I needed more. I needed him to reveal himself. The next morning, I watched him leave for work. I smiled, kissed his cheek, played the part perfectly. And the moment the door shut, I picked up the phone. I called the hospital. My brother-in-law was still weak, but stable enough for visitors. I needed him. I needed the rest of the truth. When I arrived, his eyes flickered open, and for once, he didn't smirk. "You're still alive," he rasped. "Barely," I whispered. I sat down beside him, gripping his hand. "I need you to tell me everything. No half-truths, no riddles. Everything." He closed his eyes for a long moment, then nodded weakly. And then he told me. He told me about their childhood, about how his sister, my husband's first wife, had fallen for him despite warnings. How she had been blinded by his charm, just like me. How she had discovered his experiments with poisons and mixtures, his obsession with control, with power, and how, when she threatened to expose him, she vanished. Everyone believed she had run away, but he knew better. He had seen the signs, the evidence hidden in plain sight, and ever since, my husband had been watching him, waiting for the right moment to silence him too. Tears streamed down my face as he spoke, each word a dagger to my chest. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my home, it was all built on lies. But beneath the grief, beneath the horror, a fire burned. I couldn't let her death, or his suffering, be for nothing. I had to end this. The plan came slowly, piece by piece. I couldn't outmatch him in strength. I couldn't outmatch him in cunning. But I could use the very thing he relied on, his ego. He believed he was untouchable. He believed no one could outwit him. He believed I was weak, and that was his greatest weakness. Over the next few days, I played the part perfectly. The obedient wife, the quiet partner. I cooked his meals, laughed at his jokes, laid beside him at night. But every smile, every touch was a mask. Behind it, I was preparing. I began keeping notes, recording details, his routines, his words, the vials he touched, the mixtures he prepared. Piece by piece, I built my case. And then, I set the trap. It happened one evening, weeks later. I brewed him tea, just as he once had for me. I set the cups on the table, my hands steady, my face calm. "Something special," I said softly, echoing his own words. He smirked, amused. "Learning from me, are you?" My heart pounded, but I forced myself to smile. "Yes." He lifted the cup, sniffed it, then took a sip, and as he did, I watched him carefully, because I hadn't poisoned him. No, I had recorded everything, the vials, the letters, his confession to me in the car, and now, as he drank his tea, oblivious, I pressed send. Every file, every recording, every note, sent to the police. The knock on the door came minutes later. His smirk vanished. His cup clattered to the table, And for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. They took him away in handcuffs, his protests echoing through the house. "You think this will save you?" he snarled as they dragged him out. "You think this is over?" I didn't answer. I just watched as the door closed behind him. And for the first time in years, I breathed. The trial was long, grueling, filled with lies and manipulation. But the evidence was undeniable. The vials, the letters, the recordings, and the testimony of his own brother. Piece by piece, the mask crumbled. The charming husband, the respectable man, all of it stripped away, revealing the monster beneath. The verdict was guilty. Life in prison. When it was over, I stood outside the courthouse, the sun warm on my face. For the first time in so long, I felt free. But freedom wasn't just walking away from him. It was walking towards something new. A new life. A new hope. A chance to rebuild. I thought of her again. The woman in the photograph. She hadn't lived to see this day, but I had. And in her memory, in her honor, I vowed to live. Truly live. No more silence, no more fear, only truth, only strength. Because I had learned something through all of this. Betrayal can break you. Fear can silence you. But hope can save you. And courage can set you free. So if you ever find yourself trapped in shadows, surrounded by lies, drowning in fear, remember this. You are stronger than you think. You are braver than you know. And no matter how dark the night, there is always a dawn waiting to rise. Always.